Welcome to Book Nibbles. Big ideas, small bites. World War II, by the summer of 1945, had already devastated Europe. Hitler was dead, the Third Reich had crumbled, and American soldiers were coming home from the battlefields of France and Germany. But in the Pacific, the war was far from over. Japan remained defiant, its empire scarred but unbroken, its leaders clinging to an idea of honor that demanded death before surrender. The conflict with Japan had already stretched across nearly 4 years, beginning with the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor and spiraling into one of the bloodiest, most brutal struggles in human history. Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard, in Killing the Rising Sun, plunged the reader into those final months of the war against Japan, where desperation, courage, cruelty, and the dawn of a terrifying new weapon converged to decide the fate of millions. The story begins with Japan's ferocious commitment to its emperor. Unlike Nazi Germany, where loyalty fractured as defeat loomed, Japan's military and civilians alike were taught that their emperor was divine, a living god whose commands could never be questioned. From childhood, Japanese citizens were raised on the idea that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a betrayal of family and country. Soldiers were told to fight to the last man. Civilians were told to sacrifice themselves if it meant aiding Japan's survival. The book details the fanatical training of Japanese soldiers and the pervasive culture of death, describing how kamikaze pilots, many barely out of their teenage years, willingly volunteered to fly their planes directly into American ships, believing their sacrifice would bring honor to their families and glory to the emperor. Against this backdrop, American forces had been clawing their way across the Pacific, island by island. Each battle became a grim preview of what awaited if the United States chose to invade the Japanese home islands. The authors describe in vivid detail the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. On Iwo Jima, Marines fought in volcanic ash and jagged rock against entrenched Japanese defenders who refused to surrender. Nearly every Japanese soldier on the island died, either killed in combat or by suicide. The iconic image of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi symbolized victory, but the cost was staggering: over 6,800 Americans killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Okinawa was worse still. Japanese forces, dug into caves and fortified positions, turned the island into a slaughterhouse. Kamikaze attacks rained down on the American fleet, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of sailors. By the time Okinawa fell, over 12,000 Americans were dead and more than 36,000 wounded. Yet the Japanese defenders fought almost to the last man, with over 100,000 soldiers killed and tens of thousands of civilians coerced into mass suicides by their own government. Okinawa, the authors explain, was a terrifying preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would look like: millions dead on both sides with no guarantee of victory. As American troops pushed closer to Japan, the world was also changing in secret. At remote facilities in New Mexico and Tennessee, scientists were racing to complete the Manhattan Project, the most ambitious and dangerous scientific endeavor in history. Led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, a group of brilliant physicists, engineers, and military officers worked under immense pressure to harness the power of atomic energy into a weapon capable of ending the war. O'Reilly and Dugard described the secrecy of the project, the isolated towns built for workers, and the sense of urgency as intelligence suggested Germany had been working on its own bomb. By the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered, but Japan fought on, and the question of whether to use the atomic bomb became one of the most consequential decisions any American president would ever face. President Harry Truman, who had only recently assumed office after the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt, found himself bearing this immense responsibility. Truman had been vice president for just 82 days before Roosevelt's death thrust him into leadership. He knew little of the atomic project until briefed after taking office, and the information left him both stunned and burdened. The authors portray Truman as blunt, practical, and deeply aware of the costs of continued war. His generals presented him with estimates that an invasion of Japan could cost up to 1 million American lives and several million Japanese, military and civilian alike. Truman faced a moral dilemma. Should he unleash a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, killing tens of thousands instantly, or should he send American boys into a bloody invasion that would kill far more in the long run? While this debate raged in Washington, the Japanese government was itself in turmoil. Emperor Hirohito remained largely insulated, portrayed to the people as divine and untouchable, but his advisors and military leaders were divided. Some believed Japan should negotiate surrender on terms that would preserve the emperor's authority and protect the homeland from occupation. Others insisted that fighting to the last man was the only honorable course. Even as their cities burned from relentless American firebombing campaigns, these hardliners clung to the idea that Japan could still inflict enough casualties to force the United States into a negotiated peace. The book describes how American B-29 bombers, under the command of General Curtis LeMay, rained incendiary bombs on Japanese cities, reducing them to ashes. Tokyo, in a single night of firebombing in March 1945, saw over 100,000 civilians killed, with more than 1 million left homeless. Still, the Japanese did not surrender. Each attack seemed only to harden the resolve of their leaders, even as civilians suffered unimaginable horror. In July 1945, Allied leaders gathered at Potsdam to discuss the post-war order and deliver an ultimatum to Japan. Truman, Winston Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender or facing prompt and utter destruction. The declaration was broadcast to the Japanese, but their government dismissed it as meaningless propaganda. The authors highlight the tragic irony. The Japanese leadership, still clinging to hope of favorable negotiation, had no idea that Truman held a weapon capable of fulfilling that threat. On August 6, 1945, the American bomber Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island, carrying a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy. Piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, the plane soared toward Hiroshima, an industrial city that had largely escaped previous bombing raids. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. Seconds later, the first atomic weapon used in war exploded above the city, unleashing a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun. Within moments, Hiroshima was leveled. Tens of thousands were incinerated instantly, and many more would die in the coming days from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. The authors recount haunting eyewitness accounts. Children vaporized while walking to school, shadows burned into walls, rivers filled with the dead and dying. Despite the devastation, Japan's leaders did not immediately surrender. Some even argued that the damage was exaggerated American propaganda. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The original target had been Kokura, but heavy clouds and smoke forced the bomber to divert. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, flattening the city and killing tens of thousands more. The destruction of Nagasaki, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan and invasion of Manchuria, finally broke the deadlock within Japan's leadership. Emperor Hirohito, in an unprecedented move, intervened directly, urging his government to accept surrender. He spoke of the need to endure the unendurable, to save his people from total annihilation. On August 15, 1945, Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time, announcing surrender. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor speak. The war was over. The book does not shy away from the moral controversy of the atomic bombings. O'Reilly and Dugard explore the arguments of those who believe the bombings were unnecessary, that Japan was already on the brink of collapse and would have surrendered soon without such horrific loss of life. Yet they also highlight the staggering casualties from battles like Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and the expectation that an invasion of Japan would dwarf those losses many times over. Truman, faced with this choice, believed he had acted to save lives, both American and Japanese, even though the cost was unimaginable destruction. Killing the rising sun also provides a window into the aftermath of the war. Japan, once a proud and defiant empire, lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, millions were homeless, and food was scarce. American forces occupied the country, with General Douglas MacArthur overseeing its reconstruction. Emperor Hirohito, though spared from prosecution, was forced to renounce his divinity, shattering a central pillar of Japanese identity. The occupation set Japan on a path that would eventually transform it into a peaceful, democratic nation. But in those first months, survival was uncertain and suffering widespread. Throughout the book, the authors weave in vivid portraits of the people who shaped these events. There is Truman, plain-spoken and decisive, thrust into a world-shaking decision. There is Oppenheimer, brilliant yet haunted by the consequences of his creation, quoting the Bhagavad Gita after the first successful atomic test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." There is Paul Tibbets, the pilot who dropped the first bomb, steadfast in his duty yet forever marked by the knowledge of what he unleashed. And there are the countless ordinary soldiers and civilians, American Marines clawing through volcanic rock, Japanese children clutching charred dolls, families obliterated in the blinding flash of light, whose stories capture the human cost of this climactic struggle. The narrative that O'Reilly and Dugard craft is both harrowing and compelling, a reminder of the ferocity of Japan's resistance, the unimaginable stakes faced by Truman and his advisors, and the dawn of the nuclear age that forever changed warfare and geopolitics. The book emphasizes not just the military strategies and political decisions, but the profound moral questions raised by the end of the Pacific War. Was it right to unleash a weapon of mass destruction to save lives in the long run? Could there have been another way? These questions remain debated to this day, but what cannot be denied is that August 1945 marked a turning point in human history. In the end, Killing the Rising Sun is both a chronicle of how America vanquished Japan and a sobering meditation on the cost of victory. The rising sun of Japan's empire was extinguished not only by overwhelming military force but by the dawn of a new kind of power, one that threatened the survival of humanity itself. The book closes with the recognition that while the war ended, the shadow of the atomic age had just begun, leaving the world to wrestle with the consequences of a weapon born in desperation but destined to reshape the course of history. And that's it. Killing the Rising Sun: How America Vanquished World War II Japan by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.